Alright, so if you've been following along, we are creating Google Cloud Functions to handle serverless actions for our to-do app, because what we ran into issues with NextJS hosting with Firebase is that right now server actions are not working. There's a bug going on. It seems to not be using the server side functions properly, and so we're going to solve that problem by creating Cloud Functions to handle all of those adding, deleting, updating of our to-do. So this is how we're going to get started. First, what I am going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go to my parent folder for my to-do Firebase project. I'm going to create a directory called to-do functions. Now, we could have just added the functions folder within our Next.js app. Some people do that, where everything, the functions, the server-side logic, the web app, are all in one folder. I like to separate that. I would like to have all my functions in one folder only. All right, separate from the actual web application. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and cd to the to-do func folder. And then in order to initialize Firebase functions, we do this by saying Firebase init functions. All right, so here it is. It's going to ask us whether we want to create a new project or use an existing project. We're certainly going to use an existing project that we've been using. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. We're going to select the project that we've been using, which is the to-do Firebase project that we created early on in the tutorial for creating the web applications. And then we're going to use TypeScript. We can use JavaScript, Python, TypeScript, and so on. But we're going to go with TypeScript here. Do ESLint, and we're going to install the dependencies. All right, so now that our Firebase function has been initialized, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at actually the folder that was created, which is the functions folder, as you can see over here. And then in there, there is a source folder called index.ts. Let's go into the folder. And you'll see here there's some example code already. I'm going to go ahead and uncomment this example function code that is going to accept a request, and then it is going to send a server respond that says hello from Firebase. All right, so before we can actually get started here, there are a few things that we need to be aware of when we're using the TypeScript route for Cloud Functions here, is that if we go to our package.json file, two things I want to point out. I want to point out that it's expecting a folder that contains a lib folder and in a file that's called index.js. It's actually going to have another file in there. I'll show you that in just a second. And then there is this command, npm run serve, in which it creates a build folder for us, and then it runs the emulator. I've found that this command has been causing issues. And so we're going to break that down. So to do this, to make sure that we get our lib folder, we're going to go ahead and cd the functions. And from here, we're going to npm run build. All right, as you can see, we're done running the build. And over here, the lib folder was created with index.js and index.js.map. The one I want you to pay attention to is index.js, because whatever code or functions you write here, it is going to be practically mirrored in this index.js file, as you can see, because this index.js file, it's what's going to serve our emulators, and it is also what's going to be deployed, right? So if you're ever wondering where that's there, that's what it's doing. All right, so we built it. Now what we need to do to actually run this is we're going to get out of functions folder to the parent folder, and we're going to go ahead and run Firebase emulators start. And we're only going to run functions, so we're going to do that only flag functions. Okay, so now if we look at it, initialized everything, it created a function for us with a hello world. Right, that's the name of our function here, and it gave us a URL that we can invoke here, that we can send a request to, which we can test right now. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. I'm going to split this terminal. Let's watch on the left side just so we can see as we are invoking it. if I do a curl request, enter, on the left side is going to receive the request, and then it is going to respond back to us with respond that sent hello from Firebase. As you can see here, the respond was received, hello from Firebase. Over here, it told us that it began execution, went through it, and then finished the execution without any error. So at this point, we are set at least to create our functions. What we will need to do is we'll need to create a function that will add a to-do to our database. We'll need to create a function that will delete it, update the to-do, also update whether it's completed or not. So we're going to write 4 functions that will handle our app, since we will not be using server-side actions for this deployment. So let's do it. All right, so the first thing we'll do here is let's create a new function. Let's get rid of export const hello world, and let's go with, actually, let's just do this. Just rename it. Let's create export const add to do. All right. Now what we need to do is we need to decide, all right, do we want this to be a GET request, or do we want to be this by using URL params, or do we want this to be a post request with a body included in it? For here, what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to change this so we can shorten it just a little bit. And then what we're going to import, I'm actually going to clean this up too. Let's get rid of all of these because, okay. And then from here, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and import get Firestore. Okay. What you'll notice is going to be a little bit different from our client-facing app, our web application. We are now on the Cloud Function side, so it's going to be drawing everything from Firebase admin and then whatever it is that you're trying to get as a resource. And this one is going to be Firestore. What we're going to do is let's go ahead and initialize the DB. Okay. All right. And then from here, what we can do is we can create a reference, right? So let doc.ref, or actually we can do collection ref since we're adding, right, to the collection. And then we're going to go DB collection. First, we're going to go to users, if you remember how we have set up our database. And then from there, we're going to go the doc, and then we're just going to create our own ID here, pretending this is the user. All right. And from that, we're going to go to that user's collection of to-dos. Okay. So at this point, what we've done is we've created a reference to a user, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, to a user's collection of to-dos. Okay. Now, if you remember, let's go to our Firebase, and from Firestore, notice we only have one user with this UID, right? And they have to-dos, which only consists of one to-do. Right now, what I'm doing is I'm creating a collection ref from users of a different user with an ID of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm accessing their collections. And if it doesn't exist, it's going to create it, right? So that's what we've created. And so the only thing left to do at this point is we can do collection ref. This thing's already done the work for me here, which is nice. Okay, and actually we named it to do. Let's go to do 1. Timestamp. Time. There's actually a better way to do the timestamp. There's a server-side timestamp for Firebase, which we can leverage. For now, we'll leave it at that. And then we're going to go false for completed. And we're actually going to save this action to doc.ref. And I'll show you that in a second. And it's going to be an await async, which means this function up here will need to be an async function. And before we start getting yelled at by TypeScript, we're just going to go ahead and put any here. And we're also going to put any here for now. And then what we'll do is after the request is complete, we're going to return respond with a status 200 and then send the doc ID back. All right, next thing we'll do is we'll import admin. Okay, and then what we need to do is we need to initialize the admin app. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to future-proof this by wrapping it in a try-catch block, because at some point you're going to create multiple modules of your different functions, and if you don't put it in a try-catch block, it will cause you an issue. It will time out your functions, because if the admin has already been initialized and you're calling it again, it will result into an error. So now that we're set here, what we're going to do is we need to actually run the build again before we can run the emulator. So let's do that. I'm going to go ahead and go into the functions folder, run npm run build, and then from here we're going to go back out and we're going to do Firebase emulator start only functions. Okay, it has loaded our add to do function with a URL that we can invoke and fetch from. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Postman this time. Let's open up a new request here, paste the URL over here, and click send. We should see our function receive the request on the bottom here, and then we should see a response back from the function. All right, a function has ended, and we did end up receive a status 200, but check that out, we also received the ID of the to-do that we created. Remember, in our code here, it said find the user 12345, go to their collection, create a document with a to-do called to-do1. Let's check our database. If we go here, we now have two users, one with the ID 12345, which is what we created. In the to-dos, they have their to-dos, which is called to-do1. That's awesome. So now we have a working add to-do function, but we just need to make sure that we can actually use it when we're sending fetch requests from our app. So let's modify this so it is workable. So the way we'll do this is we'll do it through URL parameters. So what we will expect from this request is that we are going to expect user UID, and we are also going to expect the to-do, which is going to be a string, and it is not going to be from the request body, but it's going to come from the query itself. Okay, so and then what we'll do is instead of having our manual user doc in here, we're actually going to use the user UID. Okay, and then the to-do is going to come in here, and that should be ready to go. So what we're going to do is let's go ahead and run our build again and test it. All right, so I went ahead and reran the npm run build so that our lib folder is updated just like what we did before, and then I reran our function, so it's ready to go. This should now be able to accept user UID and to do. So let's test that. Over here, I'm going to add the params user UID and to do, and then we'll add a value here. So this time, why don't we do this? Let's select the actual user UID of our app user, and let's give it a to-do of to-do 5, right? Because right now in our app we have to-do 2. Let's do a to-do 5. Let's see if it works. Let's send a request. Oh, as you can see, it was created right here, which means in our database it was also created via our emulator function. So now we have something that we can actually work with. All right, so our next step, now that we have add to do working here, is we're going to want to create our function for deleting a to-do, and we also want to create a function that will update our to-do, whether it's updating the to-do itself, the text, or it's updating the status of complete or not complete. right? So before we do that though, let's prepare for breaking down our code so we're not writing all of our functions in one file. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a new folder here, and we'll just call it funcs for now. And then we're going to call this add todo.ts. And here, what we're going to do is we're going to copy all of that code. We're going to paste it on here because we're going to need all of those items. I'm going to delete the loggers because we're not going to do any logging. And then in our index.ts file, what we want is we will import the add to do. All right, just like that. And then exports that add to do equals add to do that add to do. I'll explain this in 1 second. What the heck does this all mean? Basically what we're doing here is we're separating our functions into different files so that it's easier to maintain, so that if there's anything that we need to fix, we're only fixing the file and not the entire file with multiple functions in it. And then it's a lot cleaner look also. I'm going to delete items that we don't need. Don't have any on request here. And we should be set. We're going to leave the admin initialize app just in case to ensure that it is initialized, even though we have it here also initialized. Okay, so let's make sure that it works. So if you remember, we're going to go to cd functions. We're going to build it first. All right, now that the build is complete, let's go back to the parent folder and let's call Firebase emulator start only functions. All right, now that our functions are loaded up, let's make sure that it actually works. So I'm going to go back to Postman here. Let's give it a to do 7. And if you remember, I pasted the URL that's provided, which is the same as this right over here below. And then what I did was I added 2 parameters, which is the user UID and the to-do itself, which is essentially right here. I'm going to go ahead and send that. Watch over to the right side here. All right, as you can see, our code is working. Should be one of these items here. There it is, to-do 7. And our app should be rendering all of those. Awesome. So we know that works. Our next step, let's create our delete function and update function in separate files so that it's all clean and ready to be imported into our index.ts. All right, so the next step should be pretty simple because now that we have add to do as our template, we can pretty much copy this for the next 2 functions that we're creating. We're just updating basically what we're doing with it, right? So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate add to do. So we have delete to do file over here, but we need to update this. And what I did is I did prepare some code just to save us a little bit of time here. Let me pull that. Let's do the whole thing. Okay, let's go over this quickly so we understand exactly what is happening. In our delete to do, this function requires 2 items, the user UID and a to do ID, because we need that as reference to find the item that we are going to delete. If you remember in our add to do, we were requiring or expecting the user UID and the actual to do because we were just adding something new. In this case, it's going to be different. If neither are present, then we're going to return a status 400 and send a bad request. If everything is good at this point, then we're going to initialize our database by getting Firestore via our import here. And then we're going to create a reference to the actual document by accessing the collections of users, finding the user via user UID, and then finding that users or accessing that user's collection of to-dos, and then referencing the actual document with a to-do ID. Then what you've noticed in my code that I have changed is that I'm using a try-catch here, in that I am going to execute the code via try by awaiting docref delete, which is the method from our doc reference. If that is successful, no errors, then we will return a status 200. And you'll also notice that I'm sending more of an object in status saying success or error if an error has been caught. All right. So it's a lot more consistent. You'll notice our to-do here is the same thing in terms of what we are returning to the client side after the request, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Now that we are here, let's clean this up. We should be ready to go for our delete to-do. So what we want to do now is let's go ahead and const delete to-do require. There we go. And we want to export that. Okay. Now, if you're wondering why is it that this is repetitive here, if you'll notice, it's not a defaulted export. It's just an export of delete to do. So in order for it to be accessed, we're saying delete to do, because delete to do is just a reference to the file, and then that delete to do is a reference to the function itself. Okay, in case that's throwing you off a little bit. So the next step is let's update our update to do code. Let me pull up the code for that. Let's talk a little bit about it. This thing is going to require different items also. Since we're updating a to-do, we're always going to require user UID. We're going to need the ID of the to-do that we need to update. And in this time, we're going to just do both, to-do and complete, whether it's complete status or true or false status. And the same thing with to-do. Now we could separate this and have update status of to-do and then update to-do, but for our purpose, we'll handle both updating within one function. I think that'll work out okay. All right, so what I've done is, did I add it on already? It should already be added into our index.ts file, so it's ready to go. So what we want to do is let's go ahead and fire up npm run build so we can test it. Okay, so what we'll do now is go back to our parent folder and fire up our emulator. The emulator is all running. We have an add to do, delete to do, update to do. Prior to this though, I did run into some issues for not checking my code with my autocomplete here. It had code in here instead of funcs, which is the reference to this folder. So I ran into a little bit of issues. So I had to npm run build again and then fire up the emulators. But as you can see, we now have an add to do. We have a delete to do function, which is this URL right over here. And we have an update to do. So why don't we do this? Let's add a couple more to dos. So let's go. We have to do 2 over here. Let's add to do 1. All right. So I went ahead and added several to dos here, just so we have something we can work with. We have something we can delete. We have something we can do all that stuff with. Okay. So what we're going to do next is let's test our update to do. So let's go ahead and grab that URL for update to do, which is here. And let's go ahead and paste it on here. And if you remember, in our update to do, it's going to require the UID, the to do ID, the to do, and whether it's complete or not. All right, so we're actually going to need all of those. So let's go ahead and add that. User UID, to do ID, to do, and whether it's complete or not. So as you can see, now that's available to us. Now we can go ahead and fill it up. So let's grab the user UID. Let's grab, why don't we do this? In our app, we have all of these items. Why don't we go ahead and to do 6, let's update that. So we'll grab the ID of that. And then we're going to go ahead and update it from to do 6. And let's just add the word updated. And we're going to keep complete to false. And let's go ahead and send it, see if it works. All right, as you can see, our to-do just got updated, which is updated. It's still false. Let's do this. Let's go ahead and change it to true. As you can see, that updated. There it is. Now that works. All right, so our update function works properly as expected. Let's go ahead and test our delete function. So first, let's go ahead and grab the URL for our delete to do function, which is right over here. Let's go to Postman and go ahead and paste it on there. If you remember, our delete to do only requires two entities in the parameters, which is the user UID and to do ID, so as reference to what we are deleting. So let's go ahead and configure that. User UID and to do ID. Awesome. So let's go ahead and grab our user UID, which is here. Cool. And then let's grab a to-do that we want to delete. This one is to-do 3, so let's go ahead and grab that. So we're going to delete to-do 3. In our app, we have to-do 3, 1, 6 updated, completed, and to-do 4. So let's go ahead and run it and see if it works. As you can see, that worked pretty quick. We have to-do 1, to-do 3 is no longer there. Our app works exactly as expected. So now that we have all of our functions working properly, what we need to do is we need to deploy our functions to Firebase and use the URL for each of those functions within our web application so that we can properly host it in Firebase and that it would be functional. So let's do that next. All right, before we actually deploy our functions, there are a couple things I do want to point out. First and foremost, you definitely want to check your functions are checking for errors or anything like that. For example, right here, I noticed I'm only checking for user UID and to do. I actually need to make sure that there's a to do and complete. So let me go ahead and add that on. Okay, so that's complete there, just to make sure. But another thing that you probably want to do before launching this into production is that you probably want to check that your user actually exists. Now, I'm not going to do that here, but that's probably best practice within any API and application that require access to the database. So prior to any of these, right at the top, I'll probably check whether the user actually exists or not. The nice thing is Firebase does provide that for us very easily. You can implement it and it's in their documentation. Okay, so just want to make sure I point that out. In each of these functions, what I would do is definitely check whether the user exists or not. Okay, so just want to make sure, okay, everything looks good in terms of what I am expecting from each of the APIs. So let's go ahead and deploy this. First, what we'll do is let's go ahead and go to functions because I made some changes, and then run npm build. Now that build is complete, let's go ahead and go back to the parent folder and let's run Firebase deploy only functions. So that's ensuring that you're deploying only the functions. All right, so now that our functions have all been deployed, as you can see, it says deploy complete. It actually provides us with the different URLs for each of the functions. I want to show you where to find that. If you go to functions in Firebase, you'll see the list of all of the functions we just deployed, and the URLs, it's very little here, the URLs are right below each one of them. Okay, so that's how you can access them. In the meantime, while we have access to that here, we'll just access it through there so that we can create a workflow here. Let's go to our user that we're going to test this with. We want to make sure that the functions are actually working properly. Let's start with add to do. So let me copy that. Let's go ahead and go to, there we go. And then we need is user UID and the to do itself. So let's grab the user UID. And let's say Cloud Funk is working. Let's see if it is working. We received a status success with the ID of that. If we go to our to-dos, as you can see, this just popped up. And it says Cloud Funk is working. Let's take a look at our app. Check that out. That's working fine. Let's go ahead and update Cloud Funk. Let's make it true. All right, so let's go grab our URL. Let's do this. Let's just paste that. It needs a user UID. It needs the to-do ID. Okay, so why don't we add that on here? To-do ID, and it also requires the complete Boolean value or not. So let's go ahead and add the to-do ID, which is this here, and we're gonna say false. Actually, let's make this true. Then we're gonna say updated. Let's go ahead and send that. Watch right here. As you can see, it just updated. If we go to our app, it is now crossed because it is updated. And then, let's see what we got here. I do want to show you something that I made an update. If you notice, when we pass this URL parameters using a GET request, all of the items are string items, right? They're stringified. So true is actually a string, not an actual Boolean. So over here in the code, I added in our code to convert that string into a Boolean, which is what this will do, okay? The 2 exclamation mark. So in case you see that, that's what it's doing. Let's go ahead and work on deleting this one. So let's go ahead and delete it. Let's grab our delete function. Let's update this so we don't have to rewrite everything. And all this is going to need is the actual ID. It actually doesn't need a complete. And let's go ahead and send it. Let's watch this. As you can see, it deleted it. And if we go here, it's no longer there. So we know that our cloud functions, all 3 of them are working properly. So the next thing we need to do is we just need to use all those URLs, implement it in our web application so that our web application will work if we are hosting it through Firebase. So let's do that next. All right, so our cloud functions are working. We've tested it and it's behaving exactly how we expect it to behave. So what we want to do is we want to implement the cloud functions within our web application so that we are fetching using those functions to make to add to do, to delete and update our to-dos, so that then when we do deploy it to Firebase hostings, it will work exactly as expected. So let's go ahead and start by updating our to-do component, or add to-do component rather. If you remember, we have this handle submit. We're actually going to copy this because it's pretty much going to do the same thing, except instead of using the client-side way of updating Firebase, we are going to use Cloud Function. So let's go ahead and copy this. All right, we can go ahead and minimize that. And we're going to call this handle submit with func. And what we won't need this anymore. What we're going to do is we're going to grab the func URL, which is over here. Let's see if I can just quadruple click this thing. Let's copy it. Looks like it's working. Some spaces, so let's make sure we get rid of those spaces. And then this is going to expect the user UID. And it's going to expect the to-do, which we'll fill in here in a second. So if you notice, we no longer need this object either, the to-do object. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and feed it the UID, and we're going to feed it the to-do. If we go up here, I actually want to check that if there is no auth, I don't want it to run. Okay, to prevent that, we no longer need this. Instead, we're going to initialize our fetch request to our func URL. And that should be the gist of it. Of course, after running this, we can go ahead and do stuff, right? But in this case, we're going to do stuff down here. So it should be okay. In fact, we don't even need that. We can just go ahead and say await fetch. There are no any errors. We can, of course, add more error handling We won't do that for this demo. And then this, update that to on submit using our function submit method. Looks like it's ready to go, but let's go ahead and test it, see if it does work. Let's save it, and let's fire up npm run dev. All right, our app is fired up, so let's go ahead and test it. Cloud function to do. Let's see. Check that out, it's working. If we go to our database, as you can see, we have both to-dos, which is the cloud function to do. That's awesome. All right, so now the next thing that we need to finalize this application with is we need to implement the delete to do and update to do methods in our web app. So let's do that. Okay, so to implement our delete to do and update to do, we're going to want to go to the to do item. So if you remember, again, these functions right here were the functions that we use client side using Firebase API to do our updates. What we need to do is we need to create two methods that will use cloud function URL via fetch to do those updates. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to make a copy of handle blur. Let's go ahead and paste that there, and we're going to call that with func. It's going to do the same thing, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to send new value, and we're also going to send a Boolean value of complete, because if you remember, our function now accepts both the value and the completed value. So we're going to do that here in just a second. We definitely don't need a reference anymore, right? But what we do need is we need a URL. So let's go ahead and grab that URL, copy that, and let's paste that over here. And what we need to do with this one is we need to feed this several items, right? It's going to need the auth UID, the ID of the to-do. It's going to need the to-do, which is this new val. And then it's also going to need the current value of complete. So let's go ahead and do that. User UID equals auth UID. It's going to need a to-do ID, that ID, and then it's also going to need the actual to-do, which is our new value. So we'll feed that on there. And last but not least, it is expecting the value of complete, which is to-do that complete. That should be all of it. So let's go ahead and throw a try-catch block in here. And let's go ahead and await fetch. Let's call it func URL just to be consistent. Okay, beautiful. And then obviously we could use some error handling, but we're not going to do that because we want to see if this works. All right, and then over here on blur, what we want to do is going to be different, right? We're expecting this to use this handle blur with func. So let's go ahead and change on blur with that, and it should hopefully work. So let's go ahead and test it. Let's log back in, and I'm going to go ahead and change this to cloud func update. Zoom out, blur out. As you can see, it's all working properly. We can test that next when we actually implement our handle checkbox with func method. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to paste that here. Func. Again, it's going to use all of the items. it's basically going to use the same code here. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy that. The only difference is that to do, and this one is going to be checked. We've updated our onChange handle checkbox with func. So if we go here and test it, let's see if it's working. Check that out. Our checkbox is now working using our cloud function. So the only thing that we need to do now is we need to be able to delete a to-do using cloud functions. Right now, if I click on delete, this is still using server actions, which again does not work currently with Firebase hosting. So let's go ahead and set up our delete function, or at least method that invokes the function. Handle delete with func. And what we're going to need is we're going to need a URL for sure. We need to grab the function URL for delete. So let's go do that. Okay, delete to do. Let's copy that. And the only thing our delete function is requiring us to send is the UID and the to-do ID. That's enough to find the doc that is going to be deleted. So let's go ahead, copy that. Let's put this in the try catch. We don't need that. As long as it works. That also. Okay. The final thing is we need to make sure we are using the method. So let's go ahead and update this method that is currently using the server actions and use our method that leverages the function. All right, it looks like everything is good. Let's go ahead and add a couple more. Okay, and let's go ahead and delete using now our handle delete with func. As you can see, it's working. So we have officially implemented all of the methods that we were using client-side or server action-wise by leveraging cloud functions. Now that our cloud functions are fully implemented within our web application and it is functional based on our dev end, what we need to do is we need to run build and then deploy it to Firebase and test to make sure that it's working properly. So let's do that. I'm going to go ahead and run npm run build. All right, now that the build is complete, let's go ahead and deploy it to Firebase. And we are going to deploy hosting only because we have effectively created a serverless web application. All right, so now that our app is fully deployed, it gives us our URL once again, but let's grab that from our actual Firebase dashboard. So we don't need this dev localhost anymore. So let's go to Firebase. And let's go ahead and go to hosting. And from there, it will provide us our URL to the web application that we just deployed. And let's click on it. Front page is working. Let's go ahead and log in. It recognizes that we're logged in. Let's go ahead and add to-dos. That works. Great. Let's make sure we can check it. There it is. That works. And let's see if we can delete it. And our delete button also works. We can check that we are using cloud functions by going to Google Cloud. Here's our listing of all of our functions that we have deployed. And if we go to add to do and we go to logs, we can actually see all of the logs in terms of when it was invoked. So as you can see over here, status 200. It also shows you all of the parameters that were passed on. If we click on that, we can actually open it up and explore the things about the actual invocation. So that definitely is working. We go to delete to do. We can also see that it's been invoked, that we invoked delete to do with a user UID and a to do ID. If I click on that, you can look at it closer. with a to-do ID, which is right here, and it tells you that the status is 200, it completed correctly, or no errors. All right, so at this point, what we have done is we have found a solution to our issues with server actions with NextJS when hosting on Firebase. We've created cloud functions to handle the adding, the deleting, and updating of our to-dos. We have implemented it in our web application. We have deployed our web app, and we have confirmed that it's all working. So I hope that you found that very useful. It was a long tutorial, but I think we covered all of the bases as far as how to implement cloud functions and as a solution for situations like this. Thank you for watching. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe. And if there are things that you'd like to learn or want to see, please comment on the section below. Or if there are ways that I can improve, I would love to learn from you. Thank you.